Bonjour à tous. Donc, merci à ceux qui nous joignent cet après-midi. Je vais parler en français parce que une bonne partie de l'après-midi est en français. Donc, il s'agit de la première conférence annuelle de la chaire Politique éducative et mobilité sociale. Donc un partenariat entre la Fondation Ardian, la direction à l'évaluation prospective, enfin la DEP du ministère de l'Éducation nationale, vous connaissez tous, et PSE. Et donc on a choisi cette année de faire une conférence à la fois avec une partie plus recherche ce matin et demain, et une partie un petit peu plus large s'adressant à un public plus général, avec donc une présentation par Orazio Attanasio que je vais présenter dans une minute, qui va nous amener jusqu'à 15h30. Ensuite, on vous proposera quelques boissons et à 16h, une table ronde avec différents intervenants sur les questions de l'accès à un système formel de garde d'enfants, les enjeux qui sont derrière. Donc voilà, j'espère que on va vous garder tout cet après-midi, qui va être passionnant. So let me now introduce Orazio in just a few words. I could choose many things to introduce Orazio. Just first thing, he's legitimate to talk about early childhood because he got a prize by the Jacob Foundation for his work on early childhood education. So first point. And the second, a bit more idiosyncratic, is that he's a professor at Yale, but he's not any professor. He's Coles professor at Yale. So for those who like econometrics, as me, this is a major sign of his... so the Coles Foundation was the body that basically created econometrics as a field of research in the 1930s. So you have one of the sons of the founding fathers of econometrics. So that being said, I will let Orazio introduce his specific topic for today, but please join me in welcoming him. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation to give this this talk. I feel very privileged and honored to be able to do this and to talk about some of my ideas and recent research on these topics. In addition, I had the added bonus of the conference. Already this morning we heard a number of really interesting papers and research work going on this type of topics, including some work on beliefs that has been mentioned a couple of times this morning already. So in this talk today, I will focus a lot on parental beliefs and as a way to understand what parents do at home. The focus is going to be mainly on children. When I say child development, is children below the age of 3. So it's the first 1,000 days of life. And although I've been thinking a lot about this issue of beliefs and related issues that are more general for econometrics and for economics, like measurement. How do we measure things and what do we measure? And I will say a little bit about that. I will also try to, especially in the second part of my talk, to mention policy implications and policy recommendations for this type of work. And this last part is not very based on concrete results that I show you, but it's something that I feel quite strongly about it. So I guess I'm getting to the age where I'm old enough to be able to have opinions that are not necessarily based on facts. Anyway, so let's start talking about the importance of the early years. I think everybody would agree that the first 3 years of life are very important in many dimensions in the process of development for children, and they have very long-term consequences for adult outcomes. Moreover, what we see in most data And here I'll be focusing a lot on developing countries, but the same is true for developed countries. There are very large inequalities in child development. We can see it at the age of 6 months or 3 years, most definitely. And they start showing up, these inequalities, these socioeconomic gradients in development very early on, and they get larger as children grow. And this has strong implications for the intergenerational transmission of inequality, of poverty, of disadvantage. So that's understanding what happens in the early years is definitely very, very important. The other thing that we know, and I think most people would be agreeing with me, is that the early years are malleable. Individuals, humans, in their development is shaped by many factors, and many environmental factors, including parental behavior, but not only. Communities, schools, preschools all play very important roles. So if we are concerned about, if we think that giving individuals an equal field, equal opportunities in life is the right thing to do, it means that designing policies that compensate for disadvantages that face many children when they are born would be a very important issue. However, it's not easy to design effective policies. We need to understand the process of child development in the early years. It's not just a matter of running a randomized controlled trial and say, oh, this intervention works and we should implement it. Although those are very important tools that we should be using. I think to learn from those experiments and to generalize to different contexts and improve what we see in the experiments, we need to understand the mechanisms behind the impacts that we see or we don't see in the case of failures. And to do that, we need to understand the essence of the process of child development. And I think there has been a substantive amount of progress that has been done in the last few years, but there are still lots of things that remain to be learned in the process. And in particular, I think it's very important to understand what roles specific inputs in the process of child development play at different points in times. You know, what parents do, what governments can do, what schools can do. We need to understand how that works, how that gets translated in outcomes for the children, and what are the crucial windows of opportunities. And you know, there are lots of details that are very, very important, and we still don't know the answer. You know, even when I talk to some of my child development friends that know much more than I do on these fields, and I ask, okay, what's the right age to start an intervention? Is 6 months or 9 months or 12 months? And we don't know that. It's important to complement an intervention, say, at 12 months with another one at 18 months and 24 months. We don't know that. And so there are still lots that needs to be understood. An important element is the role that played by parents and parenting practices. And they play, everybody would agree that they play a huge role in child development. Parents, these days, mothers in particular, are the contact that the child has, the first contact that the child has with the world. And therefore, that's where they learn from. However, to quantify the impact that parenting practices have on child development is not easy. Simple correlations are not enough. We need to establish and measure the causal link between certain actions and the effect that those actions have on children. So do parents compensate, or do they reinforce certain shocks or certain trajectories the children engage in? Here I just want to mention, this is a student of mine. He just finished his PhD last year, Michele Gianola. He's now working in Naples, in Italy. And when Michele started his thesis started a few years back, he came to my office. At the time I was at UCL. And he showed me a graph, which really impressed me. And I never saw that type of graph before. Then he reproduced it these were data from the US, but then he reproduced it in India, in Indonesia, maybe in his thesis there is a big graph with 20 different countries, and the same pattern emerges. So first of all, he documents that if you look at the inequality across people in, say, educational outcomes or achievement, a huge chunk, around 30 to 40%, is explained by inequality within siblings rather than across siblings, which is already quite impressive. But what Michele showed me that day, which eventually shaped his thesis, and it struck to me, if you compute for a family some sort of developmental index for the siblings, and they take the average, okay? And you plot the average achievement of the kids in that family against family size, right? The evidence there is quite to be expected, declines. Why does it decline? It is a different issue. Typically, larger families are poorer, worse conditions, whatever. It declines. The surprising fact that it was a big shock for me, if instead of computing the average and plotting against family size, you compute the max. So how is the best child the best sibling in that family performs? And then you plot that max against family size. It's flat. It's as flat as a pancake, which tells me why the average declines. The average declines because if you look at the minimum, that goes through the floor. So what that tells me, that parents are making choices. They are making choices that affect how children develop, especially in disadvantaged conditions. They will have to make some cruel, if you wish, choices in the way they invest in their children. That goes to say, Michele then has in his paper a bunch of different things to explain these facts. But that tells me the first message that, and the reason I wanted to put this here, besides giving some publicity to my student, is that it's obvious that what parents do and how they do it has important implications for children. So let's think of a model of parental behavior. I promised, I think, not to use any equations. There will be maybe 2 equations later on in the talk, but I will contain myself. So, but let's think of an abstract model where parents make choices, and these choices, I guess, will depend on what their preferences are, what kind of objective they're trying to achieve. They will depend on the resources they have. And when they choose how to invest in children, and time and materials and the like, these choices will also depend, this is the blue thing, they will depend on the perceptions they have on the rate of return to that investment. So these perceptions are not necessarily rational or unbiased. There is no reason to think that parents are child development experts and they know exactly what are the right policies to or behaviors to have. So parents will be influenced by the perceived role of such inputs in the process of child development, and their social norms play an important role, what they see other people doing and the like. Now, if you just have data on investment choices in child development, it's very hard to disentangle beliefs from preferences. You know, you observe a parent spending very little time with their kids and doing very little with them. It could be that they don't love them, or it could be that they don't think that's particularly useful. Another anecdote that occurred to me in Colombia, in India, in China. You talk to working on specific parenting interventions that try to stimulate, motivate the parents to talk to their children even when they are 12 months old. A reply that I heard many times in many different contexts is, why would I talk to her? She doesn't understand what I say. You know, so there is this disconnect between the process, how children learn to talk, and what the parents perceive is the right thing to do. So one option that economists in particular have been using, because it's simple, is to assume that parents know the process of child development. So they're rational agents, so they know what the truth is. The alternative is to elicit data on parental perceptions. And that's what we've been trying to do here. There is some evidence that parents in disadvantaged situations may have distorted, biased beliefs about the process of child development. That was referring to. So they might be investing little, not because they don't love them, but because they don't think it's particularly useful. And as usual, economists are not the first people to discover these things. A book that I read a few years ago that played a huge role in my thinking about this thing is this Unequal Childhood by Annette Leroux. She's an anthropologist working in the US, and she proposes these two models that she observes among the people that she observed. And she points out that middle class and rich families follow this process of, she calls, concerted cultivation. So the kids are taken to violin class and soccer practice, and they learn and they're taught how to interact with authority, with the teacher, and the like. And then the poor and working class family, they simply think that children grow naturally. And so they pursue this process of natural growth. So there is no specific need to engage in all these kind of activities. This type of model, as you can also find in Putman book, Our Kids, which is a nice, also a nice book to read. So as economists or as econometricians, then it becomes important to try to measure these beliefs. And that's one of the things we try to do. Not only to measure them, but also try to understand how they change. What determines parental beliefs in the process of child development, and can these beliefs be changed by policy interventions? And these are the most novel things that are in these presentations. You know, maybe I should not even be presenting them, because these are, some of these results are like 2 weeks old or a month old. This comes from the work we've been doing in India. We are starting to analyze those data yet, so I should be maybe a bit more careful. So, but more generally, within the context of parental interventions, it might be very useful to measure beliefs and to establish whether interventions, maybe evaluated through a randomized controlled trial, they change these beliefs and how. So again, there is now a bit of work going on measuring beliefs about rates of returns. These are some of the papers in economics that have done that in different contexts. I think one of the first I've seen, at least, is the Flavio Cunha et al. The beliefs were elicited from mothers in a hospital in Philadelphia. So it's an interesting piece of work. And then there are some other papers in which I've been involved. Again, economists are a little bit late. If you look at child literature on child development, this is a nice paper in the journal Child Development by this guy Miller that he wrote in 1998. So we are, 25 years late. But anyway, I think the subjective data on individual beliefs are very useful, because when you do models, you can avoid to use very strong theoretical assumptions. So in this presentation, I will talk about the work we've been doing in India, which is building on some work that I've done with Flavio Cunha and Pamela Jervis in Colombia a few years back. So relative to that paper, there are a few innovations. So we have a new methods of elicitation. So, some of you might find this part particularly boring, but it is important, because it's not easy to measure individual. Economists have been very skeptical about the possibility of measuring tastes or beliefs or subjective stuff for good reasons. Talking about the Cowles Foundation, one of the people that were against this stuff was Jim Tobin in the same building where my office is now. But and they had good reasons. They're not easy to elicit this stuff. So I will bore you with some of that. And then the other thing that is very exciting is that I hope you will get as excited as I am. We measured these beliefs around the randomized controlled trial, and two arms of the interventions that we evaluate differ in the terms of the interactions that people have with each other. So not only for the first time ever, I think these beliefs are measured longitudinally, so we can show how they change. But we also vary the environment in a way that can help us to understand how people learn from each other. And so that's the last bullet point of the role of networks and in learning. So let's talk about first the boring stuff, how we elicit stuff. And actually, I had a discussion with one of the authors today. I forgot who he was, and please forgive me, but I think this is relevant for what they're trying to do. The questionnaire was designed to be answered by the mother of or the primary caregiver of the child in our survey. And we presented the respondent with questions about an hypothetical, not their own child, but a hypothetical child. And we asked her about the process of development of such a child under different scenarios. Now, we discussed a lot of whether we should ask questions about their own child or an hypothetical child. And I think that the hypothetical child works much better for a number of reasons. And then we say that the child development between two different ages, we say, okay, here is a kid that is 7 months old or 9 months old, and suppose that this kid can already do certain stuff, and that's what their mother do with them. And then we say, what's going to happen to this child in 12 months in terms of developmental outcomes? And so the first challenge that we had was to construct these scenarios, both for what we call the initial conditions, so where this child starts from, and for the parental investment, and for the outcomes. And then we vary the scenarios, the inputs. We say, now consider the same child, but now the mother does not only this, but also this other stuff. How is going to be and now consider a different child, which is at the lower level of the initial development, and the mother does these two different things. So we have 4 outcomes. And so we asked the respondents to map these 4 points into developmental outcomes. So to use the jargon that we as economists use all the time, we have a production function that relates the inputs to the outputs, and we take 4 points in the domain and try to map that. So that's my first equation. So we have we have the initial conditions, we have the inputs, and we have possibly some other factors. And I put a bar here because we say this is an average child in this village. And so one would say that the mother thinks of some sort of an average. And so we think that this is the process itself. And then we think that the mothers or the respondents have some sort of idea like this in their head, but they have their own subjective views about the specific parameters, the specific form of this functional equation. And these perceptions might not be necessarily rational. So the elicitation consists in designing scenarios for y, for the x's, and then vary them, keeping the z bar and the epsilon as constant. Now, even if you buy this strategy, there are a number of challenges. The first one is how to design scenarios. Now, I hesitated whether to show you this equation. I could not go to the field and show possibly illiterate mother the same equation. So I have to formulate my question in a way that resonates to them. So how to design scenarios. And then I want to obtain this, once I solve that first problem, number two is how to obtain this data on beliefs in the right metric. Why do I need the right metric? Because eventually I will want to compare the process that we elicit from them to the actual process. I want to be able to say, oh, on average, these people are underestimating the utility of parental investment. So I need to be careful about the metric will matter here. And then I won't talk about the third one, is the measurement error in beliefs, because perfect data, for those of you who have worked with data, should know that perfect data do not exist. So we might as well be upfront about that. Now, this is, I will just say a couple of words about this slide. This is my most technical and definitely the most boring slide in my talk. This is to say, don't look at the equations. This is to say that I have data on child development in this sample. And the data are a number of what I call markers of the latent factor of interest. So I'm interested in child development, this abstract concept, maybe in different dimensions, maybe cognition and socio-emotional stuff. But these are abstract concepts. What I observe in practice, this child of age 12 months can say this number of words and cannot say these other words. So I need to construct a mapping between my abstract concept and the measures, the markers, the observed markers that I observe. And that's what these equations do. Okay? Now, I can do that with actual data. And I have, these are lots of words. For instance, we have the data from the MacArthur language inventory, which is basically 100 words. And you ask the mother, does your child say this word? Does it work? And you do it 100 times. Once I run this data, this model on actual data, I can choose what are the most salient words, the one with the high beta. This is the factor I'm interested in and I do not observe. And I want to estimate from the M's, which is what I observe. So I can choose words that are particularly salient for development. And then I can use those words to construct my scenarios. That's what we do in practice. And that's important because, it's important. It's useful to use this metric and this machinery. Language is particularly nice because in my experience, even when you are in very disadvantaged situations, parents are very, they're aware of the language that their children use. They know which words they can or cannot say. And they also relate directly the language development to children development, to child development more generally. So language is very, very salient and is relatively easy to observe. So that's how we define the scenarios for initial conditions and for final outcomes. This is the way we do a similar trick for the parental investment. We have data on what is called the home, which is a standardized index, and then we choose the most, we estimate again a factor model, we choose the elements that are most salient to describe individual investment, and then we help the responder with these vignettes. So this is a low investment situation because the child is left alone, both when the mother does homework and when she goes to the market. And here is a much more engaging situation because the mother does a bunch of things with him, and when they go to the market, she involves the child in the purchasing and stuff. Again, these were not drawn at random. We identified items from the home that seemed to be particularly salient to describe parental investment. So the outcome we consider is cognitive and language development at age 36 months. So we say this is a child of 12 months. What's going to happen under these 4 different scenarios to this child at 36 months? And there we identify certain outcomes. Again, there's the ability to say certain and use certain words. But rather than say, will this child say these words, we ask them, what's the probability that the child of 36 months under this particular scenario will say these words? So again, this was a long discussion about whether we should use these or different approaches. But it turned out that, this is different from what we did in Colombia. It works much better this way. This is an example of the questions. So we say, suppose there are 100 children, 12 months old, for whom speaking is more difficult. They are able to say words as water, bye-bye, or milk, but they are still not able to say more difficult words as table, meat, or pitcher. Again, these are words that are chosen from the MacArthur. If the mother of these children spends a little time per week with her child, out of these 100 children, how many of them will be able to say easy words like nose, bread, or eye at the age of 36? And then we ask this question 3 times, and between the 3, they differ in the difficulty of the words. And then we do it the same thing for this is low parental investment and high parental investment. Yeah. Both. We say easy words like nose. This is the translation from Orilla of the actual question that we used. Okay, and this is the high initial condition. The same thing. Again, another thing, the metric thing. This becomes very easy because once I say a child can say this set of words, I have estimated my model before. The probability of that child is 0.75. I can say this child is level of developmental of 209, using the same metric that I use estimating my factor model, and that will allow me to then translate my beliefs questions in the same metric that I use with the actual data. And that's this is for the hard words. Then you do something similar. for the other type of words, so the medium and easy, and then you can average out, you can do instrumenting, you can do all sorts of econometric tricks, which is what says here. So let me skip the measurement error. So the data we collected, this data were around an RCT that we ran to evaluate a parenting intervention in the state of Odisha in India. And we collected data baseline and a midline on beliefs. The midline was 12 months after the baseline. There was also an endline collection, but we changed the beliefs there rather than beliefs about the productivity of investment, of parental investment, was the productivity of the Anganwadi centers, the nurseries where they give. So the scenarios were not high and low parental investment, but was for older children attending good or less good Anganwadi centers. So we haven't even touched those data yet. And so I will show you some descriptive statistics on the subjective probability. And we can do this for all the 4 scenarios. And then we can look at, try to validate this, and I'll tell you how we do it, and then check how the beliefs change over time. So these are the data. This is histograms of the probability for, this is the low initial development, low investment, low initial development, high investment, and high, low, and high. And so this is there is not a huge amount of bunching, but they seem to make sense. Moreover, if you this is how they change between baseline and midline. So things do change over time. 12 months later, these are the same people. And then once we have these 4, we can from the probabilities. These are probabilities, right? What's the probability that the child will say this stuff? And this is how they differ in the sample. Once we know these probabilities, and we know for low initial development, high and low investment, we can compute the rate of the return of investment, of parental investment. That's what we do in this graph here. So this is, and we can do it twice, with the low initial condition, with the high initial condition. So this is the rate of return in terms of increase in probability of saying certain words when the child is the low initial conditions, there's the high initial condition. First of all, at least they're mostly positive. We don't force them to be positive. So they are free to say what they want. So we can have, maybe some people think that spending a lot of time with their kids actually harm them. But by and large, they are positive. And there are differences between low and high initial conditions. In general, in this population, this is the same in Colombia, parents think that the productivity of investment is higher for low initial condition kids. You can see that the mean on the left is 18 and on the right is 17. So that's and that's how this rate of return change from baseline to midline. So the midline are the pink one. Because I told you we do this 3 times with the for the outcomes, the future outcomes, and so we do easy, medium, hard work, and we can do factor analysis on that to establish, what kind of things happen. And here you can see that the easy words were pretty much a waste of time. We could have avoided, while the factor loadings are consistent on the low and high initial conditions for the medium and hard words, while for the easy words they're all over the places. Okay, and so that's is for easy words is a different type of measurement error. Now, to validate this, starting to validate these things, we say, okay, do they matter? Do these beliefs matter? We observe their actual investment. So now we can relate with simple regressions their actual development, their actual investment, measured as both time and material investment, into, and so those are the two components. We can relate it to their perceived return to those investment. And you can see that there is, especially for the high development kids, there seems to be important determinants. So if you look at the last two columns, you can see that the perceived return to under high initial development is very strongly significant. For those of you that are econometricians, there is the first one is OLS, the other is IV to take into account measurement error, and we use the hard words to instrument the medium words answers. So that's and you can see that is classical measurement error. So coefficient goes from 0.05 to 0.1. So it's the bias induced by measurement error is definitely there. Okay, so that's the first step of this research, and it shows that this elicitation of beliefs seems to be related to actual behavior of people, investment behavior, and the same is true. This is for the end line. Now, let me tell you a little bit about the intervention, because I need to do that to explain the second part of this research agenda. As I said, this was an RCT which was conducted in 3 districts of Odisha, and we had 192 villages. So it's pretty big experiment. The 192 villages were randomized in 4 groups. A control group, a group that received just an educational intervention, and then the 2 most important ones were a parenting intervention which was delivered through home visits. Remember, these kids were about 9 months at the beginning, and so we had these home visits once a week. A visitor that was trained by Pratham, which is the NGO with which we worked, would go to the house and spend about an hour with the mother and the child, trying to improve their practices. And then the last arm was, rather than having individual visits, you had 8 mothers with their children coming to a place in the center of the village, and the same sort of activities were delivered as a group rather than individual. And this is going to be important because now you create immediately contacts among these people, and we'll see how important that is. So what we found from this is published. We have a paper in Pediatrics, and we found, to our surprise, that both interventions, both the home visits and the group visits, had about 0.3 of a standard deviations impact on cognition on the children, as measured mainly, but not only, by the Bayley's index. So that's published, and it's there. Now what we can do is to say, okay, where did this come from? We see that there is an increase in parental investment. Does it come from changes in beliefs? So these are the treatment effects on beliefs, and this is the 3 groups. This is the nutritional education, group stimulation, and individual stimulation. So those are the 2 measures of beliefs that they have. So the productivity of investment under low initial conditions and high initial conditions. And you can see there is nothing happens, on average at least, on the low initial condition. For here, there is some movement, and especially for the group stimulation, is significantly different from 0. Those are the green bar are the confidence interval. So the group stimulation seems to have increased the beliefs, and those are the tables that correspond to those graphs. And these are not just the means, but the distribution of beliefs, how it changes across intervention. My telephone tells me things. Yeah.
So the effects, it's in terms of probability that they would say
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. You know, the nice thing about another nice thing about the probability is that you can compute rate of return right away. So how much the probability change if you change investment from low to high, and so there is that. And then you can check how they change with the different interventions. So the next step is much more adventurous, and is to say, okay, now suppose that we don't want to do just these returns in terms of the probability, even because it's difficult to compare to the actual data. But we say, suppose that parents, like we do, having at the bottom of their head a production function in mind. Okay, so they have. When we estimated this production function, a Cobb-Douglas is a pretty good approximation, which is there on the board. So this is the actual production function. And we can estimate data. We have estimated this on the actual data. So this is the development of the child at age t. This is the development of the log of the development of the child at age t minus 1 and the parental investment. And so the productivity, the marginal product of investment is psi 2 in this particular case. And now suppose that you're willing to assume that the parents know the functional form, so they have that form correctly, but they don't know necessarily the right parameters. Okay? Now, if in their mind, this is what is in their mind, how can we convert the questions that we elicited on the beliefs into these parameters? So this is the individual production function. And so now we have all our questions. We have 12 questions per parent. So with the 4 scenarios, times 3 is the easy, medium, and hard work. We use that to estimate mu1 and mu2 at the individual level. So we have estimated already using the actual data the psi1 and psi2, and we have one. We have 2 parameters, psi1 and psi2. This is the truth, and then we can use it. We can use the beliefs data to estimate mu1 and mu2 for every respondent. And so, and then we can say, how do they do in practice? Do they underestimate an average or overestimate the productivity of investment, say? So that's the true production function. So the coefficient, this is trying to take into account that parental investment is endogenous. So don't get me into those details. But the 2 parameters, mu1 is 0.14, mu2 is 0.76. So remember these 2 numbers. Okay, this is the one estimated at the individual level. So I have, 1,400 of them, because I can do it for every respondent. On average, mu1 is 0.62 and mu2 is 0.7. So there is this is a baseline, and then a midline they change a bit. So this is useful because now you can see how they change over time, but also you can compare them to the true numbers. And again, we find that there is an underestimate of the relative size, of the relative importance of parental investment. So it seems that this is in a way in agreement with the Andler-Rowe argument that this parent seems to underestimate the importance of parental investment. And this is how they change over time. The next step, and that's the hardest and the most preliminary one, is to try to understand how these things change over time. And as I said, this is very new stuff. I'm not even sure I should be presenting it here, but I guess I feel I'm in an adventurous spirit. So parents might have some ideas about the mu1 and mu2, and that's what we estimate at baseline. They might not be certain about that. And then they observe their own child growing, and especially in the case of the group interventions, they observe the other children. And they might use that evidence to change and modify their beliefs about child development. It modifies their mu1 and mu2. You see, let me step back for a second to try to communicate what is at least my thinking about this. It's true that making the assumptions that parents have in their head the Cobb-Douglas production function is a strong stuff, and it's an abstraction. No deny about that. However, I think it's true that they have some ideas about the process of child development, and you might want to approximate that with some math, like Sally tells me that, don't talk Greek to me. There is some of that. However, it's useful. Why? Because now, when I start thinking about learning and modifying beliefs, it becomes much easier to manipulate this stuff. If I just use words and say, okay, they have an idea about the process of child development, and then they change it, it becomes much harder to formalize the evolution of individual beliefs. And so I think our role as a scientist, as researchers, is to put some sort of a net on reality and use this net to go from one node of the net to another to make inferences. And that's what we are trying to do here. So yes, there are some strong assumptions. The model we use is not the picture, it's not the photograph of reality, but could be a decent approximation. And it's an approximation that allows us to make jumps from one node to the next and maybe learn something. So having used this representation now allows me, I can estimate the mu's at baseline, and I can estimate the mu's at midline, and I can see how they evolve and how this evolution might be related to observations that they have when observing the children and the growth. The beauty of this data set is that I not only observe the individual child, but I also observe the children that live around them. And so I can see how these children develop changes their own beliefs. And so what I can do is to say, suppose that this is the craziest part of this approach, but I don't know whether this will survive. But suppose now at midline, each mother goes and runs a regression with the children in her village. And then she obtains these other mu's, this mu v. And then what she can do is modify her initial view of the world, which were these mu's here, with the new ones, with the new evidence. So this is similar to Bayesian learning. So where you use your prior and your evidence, and you combine them, and you obtain a new estimate. Now, This is not super formal, it should be improved, but that's the basic idea. The delta 1 and delta 2 are the weights that they give to the new evidence versus their prior. Okay? And again, I find this attractive because it allows me to see how people make inferences, how they use the reality around them to change their views. And if you think of policy, suppose that I convince you, and we have the data from Colombia, we have this new data now, that these people underestimate the return to investment. And suppose then I convince you that the group arm of the intervention changes those views. Then again, this is while the individual one doesn't. Then he says, okay, in the short term they might have the same impact, but at the same time, the second delivery mode of the intervention allows me to change beliefs. And we've seen that the beliefs are related to investment. Now, I'm making lots of jumps on this net that I've been constructing, but that's the way we do as scientists. We should be learning, I think. So that's where we go. A few other things in my last 5 minutes on the intervention. One amazing thing about the group, about the whole project, is how few people these women know. These are relatively small villages and quite isolated. So before going there, I thought, everybody knows everybody else. I grew up in a small town in southern Italy. Everybody knows everybody else there. That's definitely not the case here. The median number of people outside their household that a mother in our sample knows is 1. They don't know anybody. They typically get married into the village. They come from somewhere else. So these are young women. They are not allowed to go out without an escort, and so they don't know everybody. And so fortunately we measured this thing in all our data. We measure how many people they know, and also what do they talk with their acquaintances. Do they discuss children, food, credit, gossip, all this. So we can see that. And what we see is these are the questionnaires we have and we know these networks within the groups, within 8, the group of 8. Who do you know here? And so that. And then we can compute the standard measures in network analysis. So we can compute the outward connections, inward connections, and we can compute some index of centrality, all this kind of stuff. But the point I wanted to make is that the intervention, the group interventions, has a considerable and sizable impact on the number of connections in the village. These are the impacts. And that's the table that corresponds to that. And so now we can within these groups you can see whether there is what kind of learning. There, let me just show you one table, and then I'll go straight to the conclusions. Here, rather than using the Muse as I told you before, we use the initial the changes in the Muse and model them as a function of what happens in the network. And so they receive a signal from their own child. So how the child grows is definitely important. And then we put the average of what happens in the group and the max. And the evidence here is that there are role models in the group. So the muse seem to be changing, especially the change in the muse seems to be driven by what happens to their own child and what happens to the best child in the group. And this is true particularly in the group sections. So so this is the one with the Bayesian learning, and you can see that for the mu2 things both matters, the initial condition, the initial beliefs, and the signal that they observe from the village. They're quite significant. Okay, let me conclude that because I want to spend a few minutes on I think I do have a couple of minutes, right? I would like to summarize what I said and mention a few additional thoughts about policies. So what we've done in this work is the one thing is we introduce a relatively novel way to measure beliefs, and we analyze their relation to parental investment and their evolution. And the second bullet point is important because it's a validation. So I come here trying to sell you these new measures, but I better be able to validate that and relate it to actual behavior, and that's what we do. I wrote this slide a couple of days ago. I received some comments from here, but in particular, I went to lunch with my friend Sally Granta McGregor, and Sally asked me, "Why is this useful? So what are you doing with this belief stuff? Just do the intervention child development." And so this was my answer to her. So I think at the basic of at the beginning, what I said that is important is not just to establish whether an intervention works or not, but why it works. And why is that? It's not just a scientific curiosity. It's also the recipe to design new interventions and improve the existing one. And we know that what parents do is very, very important. Sally has been teaching me for all these years that what is key is, especially in the first 3 years of life, is to change parental behavior. Because we have the evidence that some parents don't do enough, and they could do it. It's not just a matter of money, it's a matter of what you do, how you interact with your child and all that. So we need to understand parental behavior. And as an economist, when you write the models of parental behavior, a parental investment, it will depend on resources, taste, and beliefs. That's what it depends. We used to omit beliefs because we used to make the assumption that parents know the reality. So there is no variation in beliefs. They know they're all rational child development experts. So that was the basic assumption. But that's not true. And we have evidence that that's not true. So it depends on the beliefs. And therefore, understanding how these beliefs are, characterize them, and how they can change over time, it can be important for the design of policy. And that's the main message I want to do. And that's why I risked something in showing you this very preliminary stuff. But I hope that the lesson I've been trying to convey is the approach. I need to understand how beliefs are, what they are. I need to measure them, and then I need to understand how they change it, and how policy can change them. And the little evidence we have on how they change in the group interventions rather than the home visits intervention might be important for that. So I think, as I suggested, there is a lot of work that remains to be done in this field. There are lots of things that I don't know, and I don't think anybody knows either. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Orazio. We have time for questions, so we have at least 20 minutes, but we can even make it to 30 if there's lots of questions. So anyone who wants to start? So the hardest part is to start. Oh, Karen.
Thanks, Orazio. This was great, and as usual, lots of food for thought. I wonder whether you can say a little bit about, you mentioned social norms kind of along the way, and when you were talking about updating beliefs, you were talking about, in the group dimension, is updating beliefs by observing other children, but of course you're also observing other parents. So are they updating on the investments or on the outcomes, or possibly on both?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I would like to say two things about that. The idea is, I didn't have time to go into all the details, but when we don't do the the Bayesian stuff, or what I call the Bayesian stuff, when there was this other table where there were signals, the signals are not just computed from the children development, but also from the observations that of what the other mothers do. So the assumption that is that each individual mother observes how the other mothers manage their children, and they infer that. Moreover, we can, because we know who she talks to within the group, we also give them different. We construct a syntax of connectiveness between every two, so we can weight the signals that she receives. So I know exactly what you do, but I don't know what Luke does with his child. So I can give you lots of weight to you, but not to him. So that, again, this is at the very beginning, this stuff. So, but that's what we're good. The other thing is social norms. It's not here at all. We haven't done anything on social norms here. But personally, I do think that it's a really important thing to try to measure. We have been thinking about designing experiments or instruments that would allow us to measure social norms in different domains. Because here is a social norm about child investment, but there could be other social norms that are very, very important as well. And that's another measurement agenda that is very important to pursue.
Orazio, thank you. So I'm going to pick on your Bayesian analysis. I'm joking, but a question about. So I'm curious how you are thinking about. If we did think about this as like true Bayesians, we care about that mean shift in the expectations, in addition to, how the kind of my personal distribution of expectations was changing over time, right? So as I add more information, it's going to become narrower. But when you're measuring the subjective expectations in this way, you don't really have a direct measure of that at the individual level, right? So how are you thinking about that?
You're absolutely right. The one thing that we do not have from our measures, effectively do not have, I can infer what they think about the mu1 and mu2 on average, but I don't have a measure of the degree of uncertainty that they have. So in a way, that was inferred as the average uncertainty from the deltas from the regression, but I don't have the individual level of uncertainty on the parameters. Because to be honest, when we designed this stuff, we were not thinking in those terms, and so the question is I don't think they reflect directly that.
Do you have a sense from, say, the testing whether parents are reporting to you the mean of their expectations, or
not with the data I have? I can tell you this was a nice. sorry, I don't have a picture of that. But the first time we did this, type of thing, we had an idea of trying to capture uncertainty as well, and so we had a tablet in Colombia, and by a tablet I mean a piece of wood with a rope on it and 2 beads, and you say, okay, under this scenario, and there were all the ticks with the ages. So at what age if you had just 1 bit, at what age the child, or in our case, what's the probability? We first started a different measure. We say, what is the earliest age this child will say these words? What is the latest age? And so if she's certain that the child will say this at 19 months, she will put both beads there. If she's uncertain, she will space them out. It didn't work. At least in the field, did not work, because they would put first and then they would move the other more or less randomly. So, yeah, it could be tried, but.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. So my question is about the fact that parents underestimate their productivity. Do you have heterogeneity in parents, and can you show which characteristics of parents, like level of education or gender or wealth or whatever, would not explain? I mean, it's just to know whether the bias is explained by some characteristics.
So it's very difficult to find observable variables that explain variability in the beliefs. We looked at that, both in this data and in the Colombian data. In the Colombian case, the one variable that was significant in a regression, so there is some association, was the results in the Raven tests. So the mothers with the higher score in Raven had a higher expected return to investment.
Yeah, but because they do have a higher productivity actually. So the question is not really
why this
higher productivity, because it's obvious, but whether the actual productivity is reduced or not.
What do you mean by actual? I don't observe the actual productivity.
You say that you measure the bias, so you can.
So the actual productivity is estimated in the population as an average. So it's one number. I
cannot do it by subgroup and
maybe. Yeah, but what we do is that once I get their subjective probability, which I have 1 per individual, then I can relate those numbers to observables. And as I said, the only variables that seem to associate with that was the Raven, the score in the Raven.
Maybe just because it's related to that. In fact, there is a distribution of returns, right, to investments. And so that's another way to ask the question. So somehow it's maybe that those parents with the lowest return. So I understand you take a typical child. So in principle, it should be the same psi for all parents, but maybe they have a different typical child in mind, right? And so you could reconcile their subjective measures with the fact that they know in which part of the distribution of returns to productivity they are, right?
Yeah, in the questionnaire, we make an effort to say that imagine there are 100 children in your village, and the only distinctive feature of these children is their level of development. So this child can say this word, and this word, and cannot say these other words. And that's the only characterization. So our assumption is that they take an average of the conditions of people in that village. But, it can be right.
So, again, a related question. Did you look at whether the MUIs tend to correlate with the child baseline level of development it would be a way to test if it is indeed the case that they have the same hypothetical child in mind, or if it's actually influenced by their own child?
So I think we did that in Colombia, and we did not find. I don't think we tried this in this Indian data, but I should check. There are some questions over there.
Thank you, Orazio, for the really interesting talk. You started off with the idea that there's lots of variation within families in the extent to which children learn and parents invest their time in children. How do you relate that part of the talk with this within family variation with the second half, with what's happening when parents are changing their beliefs?
So the within family is, in my opinion, is way under researched, especially in economics. And there are lots of things that happen within families that are not well understood. That's why I liked very much the thesis of Michele, my student, who looked at that. And Michele designed a small experiment lab in the field sort of thing in Cuttack, which is the town where we first piloted this stuff in Odisha. And what he found there by these vignettes and this elicitation is that parents do not have they are not very averse to inequality within the family. So they seem to in pursuing some sort of efficiency, they are not too concerned about unequal allocations within the family. So that would be consistent with with what I was saying earlier. They seem to maximize total output rather than preferring maybe a slightly less efficient but a more equitative distribution across children. But I invite you to read Michele's paper. It's a really good paper. There are lots of aspects to it. Liz.
You've given us a lot to think about. It's really exciting. I want to ask you a question and then also raise a potential challenge to measuring moms as well as measuring children. The question is this: I think it makes total sense that when you put moms together with other moms who are living within the same community, you're going to really enrich the information that they're getting about child rearing, and that's going to improve their behavior and maybe also their confidence and also give them more of a support system. So that all seems like a really good thing to do. But I think we also know that over these same early childhood years, it's not only moms who benefit from developing a social network in their local community, but kids do too. And kids start learning the particular network of relationships that structures their environment very, very early. We've got some evidence that even by the first birthday, when children see a person they know interacting with someone they don't know, they make inferences about the person they don't know based on the interaction that they're seeing, and further third-party inferences as well. So they're also developing a social network. And I wonder whether it would be interesting in the context of the work that you're doing to be looking not only at outcomes in the child in terms of how well is the child doing by some standard markers later on, but the developing knowledge in the child about their own social network and their developing ability to call on other people and learn from them. So that's the question, but I want to link it to what I see as a challenge with the work you're doing, and I think some of the questions brought this up as well. I think often what makes for good parenting is a set of intuitive assumptions that don't get expressed in explicit beliefs or judgments about what percentage of children are going to do this or that or the other. And I wonder if side by side with the challenge of developing good cognitive measures for kids, we should be thinking about developing good cognitive measures for their parents to get at what they're actually intuitively using in their parenting and what's actually structuring their decisions as opposed to what they tell you the basis for their decisions is.
Yeah. Both of them are very interesting. Let me start with the second, which was the more direct question. This goes back. If you remember, at the beginning of my presentation, when I talked the way I described the way we start thinking about these issues. Something that we debated at length among us was: should we ask them directly what they think, or should we pose the question as the inference about an average kid? And we decided to go for the latter because we thought that they would do extensive, for two reasons. One, that they could do extensive ex post justification of their practices, and more importantly, because it would be very difficult for us to change scenarios. What we want to know the productivity of investment, is to say, what do you expect the development of the kid being with this level of investment versus this level of investment? That's why we did everything with an hypothetical child, because in the hypothetical child we can change the initial condition and you can change the investment. And we find it very hard to frame it differently. I hear you, and I wish I knew the answer to that. And I know that this approach has got limitations, but at the moment this is the best thing we could come with. And if you tell me, okay, why don't you try these other questions, I would be more than. We are now collecting data in lots of developing countries on children. We have, for certain, two big data initiatives. One just already started in Ghana, and one in Tanzania that is going to be even much larger than this. So we are very much open to suggestions. And the first point was
social networks in kids.
Yeah. So the story of the Edisha data is that we were supposed to do. So we did another intervention after this, which is improving the preschools that they attend. Again, it's an RCT, and we cross-randomize, so we'll have early, late. The big advantage, and so we do have measures on connections. We know whether the kids go to the same nursery or not, because there are several. Even in the small villages, there are 2 or 3 nurseries, so we'll be able to see that. At least they have connections with the same kids that they had in the group. The end line of that was supposed to happen in April 2020, and so we had to stop that. But we just finished collecting data now, on 2 years late, but now the kids in school. But it's a great idea. The other thing is that when we did talking about mothers, when we did the first pilot in Qatar in the slums, we found an effect of this intervention on maternal depression. It went down, and we related it partly to the success of the children. We don't observe anything on maternal depression in this one. So in the villages, we did not affect maternal depression. But in general, the possibility of measuring social norms and things like that, I think, especially in this context, is very, very important. I say especially in this context, probably true in Paris or in New Haven as well.
Hi, thanks. Just a question, maybe out of curiosity mainly, because I don't know the development literature very well in education, but it seems to me that one of the key determinants of parents' beliefs and practices is actually their own parents' beliefs and practices, and that people are just like redoing exactly what their parents have been doing, and that this context in which these moms are just taken from their own family and put suddenly in another family is actually a pretty good context in like seeing how these beliefs may be affected. So I know it's out of your RCD, of course, but like is there any literature or data about that right now?
I don't know. I think yours is a very interesting question, and how I don't know. What I do know is that it's very common that they get married into a new village. That's very, very common. And that's one of the reasons they know so few people. One thing that, going back to part of Liz's question earlier, when we started this with the two arms, the individual visits, the home visits, and the group visits, my preconception, and I think Sally thought the same, lots of us thought, oh, we're going to do the group visits, we are going to dilute a lot because we've done the home visits in Colombia, and there's lots of emphasis on focusing on the curriculum is the reach up curriculum is very prescriptive, and I think it should be. However, the flexibility that the visitor has and is encouraged to do is to adapt the level of the curriculum to the specific child. So if the child is finding this stuff too easy, move him up, or if it's finding it too frustrating and difficult, move him down. And when you have a group of children, you have 8 children, you lose that. And so we thought this is going to be a disaster. We didn't realize that until we actually went to see the groups, there is the social dimension, which is amazing. If the person running the group is a smart one, she can use some mothers as role model and get help from some of the mothers. And the children they don't interact. They're 12 months, so they don't interact much with them, but the mothers do, and that can be very, very important.
And even before they're interacting, they may be learning, observing the interactions that are going on.
Yeah. So no, I completely changed my mind with that, and in fact, I don't know exactly why, but the size of the impact is the same. It's 0.3 in both the individual and the group, and by the way, the group costs a fraction to run than the individual, because you do 1 hour instead of 8 hours.
So thanks, Orazio. My question goes back to the belief elicitation. So I mean, we've heard some questions about that, and I think it's quite cognitively demanding. Obviously, what you do there. I'm in favor of doing kind of seemingly complicated stuff, but I think there is some trade-offs, obviously, right? And I like the approach with these words and everything. But one thing that I wonder is whether if we use these types of measurements, we might kind of run into problems if we talk about inequalities, because it seems likely to me that this measurement is very different for educated people versus low educated people in terms of precision and so on. So you mentioned these effects of IQ in Colombia. This would be kind of implicitly saying that there might be differences. So my question would be, do you see any differences in terms of how much noise you catch depending on education background? And how would that be kind of maybe driving or not driving differences between high and low ability or high and low education groups? So you get the point. The more complicated the measure, the less precise it could be for maybe the group we're most interested in to learn about. So,
okay, I agree in part with what you said. Not with this last point, because it's not the complication is on us, in the sense that you take some existing data and you do your homework. You run your factor models. You identify what I like to call them markers of development that might be particularly salient, A, to capture the development of the child, and B, they are salient for the mother, for the respondent. And so there is no complication there. You go to a mother and say, imagine a child that can say this words, this words, and this words. That's pretty easy. And that's very salient, even for mothers with a very low level of education. What probably it is true, and I worked only with populations both in Colombia and in India that were fairly disadvantaged. Our sample in Colombia was the 20% poorest household. Obviously, if you want to do a representative sample, maybe then you'll have to adapt these questions to different backgrounds and the like. And at that point, comparability from a statistical point of view, this issue of the metrics that I was referring to will become much harder to do. But I agree, if you move out of those populations, it might become complicated to use just one one questionnaire. Yeah, I don't. You don't seem completely convinced, but I cannot think of.
I think it's cognitively demanding to do a hypothetical scenario.
I don't agree completely. You have to be careful the way you choose these words. But language is great because language, they connect to it. It's not that you tell, oh, imagine this child that knows how to solve differential equations. No, you say, imagine this child knows how to say this word. And they know that. They know what that means, and they know whether the child does or does not say that word. So there are these two properties. The one is that we know is salient for development, and two is salient for the mother. They are aware that language development is a marker of their own child development, and they care about that. In many occasions, I found myself in the field talking to these mothers. Unfortunately, I don't talk Orilla, but I did that in Colombia with the Spanish, and they were, the one thing that they ask, oh, my child doesn't say many words, and she's 2. And so it's pretty clear to me, at least, that they care about that. And why? Because they are aware of that. That is a good marker of development. And definitely they care about their kids.
I think that part is great. That's what I meant with the word. So I totally agree with this one. It's more the setting. But yeah, we can discuss later.
It's about time to conclude. I'm still checking if the cocktail the drinks are ready. So I may ask you one last question, changing a little bit gears, if I may. You refrain a little bit from going to specific policies. You insisted a lot, and as researchers, we're used to doing that. We need a little bit more research. But is there? I mean, given also the audience here, is there any obvious don'ts or do's from that, or any direction for policies that would be interesting to go?
Thanks a lot for this question, because I thought to add this a few remarks on my concluding slide, and I didn't. And that's something that I actually been thinking about. So I think we know a fair amount about interventions that might work, and that's pretty clear to me. And there is plenty of evidence that some interventions for the early years, if well executed and well designed, they will have a big impact even in the long run. There is the preschool, there are all sorts of, and there is Jamaica. The big challenge, I think, is, and it's a really big challenge, it's a difficult one, is how to scale them up, how to implement them at scale in an effective way. And I'd say it's a big challenge because if we throw money at this thing without being sure that they work, there could be some really negative long-run effects, in the sense that people will start saying, look, we have been wasting all this money and you don't see anything. So it has to be, we have to think about implementation very, very carefully. And implementation, and that's something I changed my mind quite a bit over the last few years. Implementation is not just money. Obviously, money is important. But it's not just having the resources. It's also about, especially for things like this, like parenting practices, it's about getting buy-in from the communities, from the recipients. You have to find a way to convey this type of messages in an effective fashion. 2 examples, one positive, one negative. Smoking. It took us a few years, but I guess everybody accepts that smoking is not very good for your health. And therefore, if you look at the prevalence of smoking, I don't know in France, but in other places, it has been going down quite massively. On the negative side, masks and vaccines in this last 3 years. You know, I was struck by how slow this thing, especially the no-vax position and all that rubbish, how long it took. And this is because behaviors are ingrained and they resonate in a number of dimensions that it gets very difficult to address. And therefore, for that reason, I think it's very, very important that policymakers, and I believe we have some here, the policymakers use these existing infrastructures to deliver. Not just because it's cheaper, also because the people that are already in the field, they are known to the potential beneficiaries. They might be recognized. They can, you know, we had last week this panel on inequality, the Deaton Review, where we discussed these things. It's not just a problem of money, it's a problem of belonging to a feeling of belonging to a society and to a social structure that doesn't despise you. And therefore, you know, poor people receive lots and lots of messages. And all sorts of people talk to them, you know, quackers and preachers and all sorts of ideologies. Why would they trust you? And so you have to find a way to reach out to them in a convincing way. And the best way is through agents in the community. And so it is a big challenge, but I think that's what it is. And I'll stop here.
Thanks.